practice. Now, yesterday I got some requests to share reading texts for my lecture, and I responded to one request that the reason why I've not provided any reading material is actually deliberate. So to read in preparation for a lecture is a pedagogical approach that is very helpful. And obviously we could explore other pedagogical approaches. And so my talk today might be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's the very idea of trying to explore various ways of engaging with knowledge and how we construct knowledge in the field of religion and development. So the lack of reading resources is deliberate. And secondly, Nora, although I didn't discuss this with you, I would like to suggest that we'll do the second session slightly different. So I formulated a number of questions, and maybe we can chat at the end of this lecture how we would proceed. So there is clearly no denying that decoloniality must be an imperative in research on religion and development. And the agency of this has become very evident in various ways, including popular commentary, social movements, and indeed in scholarship. And a few lecturers have already hinted at that. However, it seems that the litany of proposals to decolonize this or that may seem to suggest that decolonization appears to be a comfortable word in recent academic balance, when in actual fact, it is not. I think we've all come across phrases, decolonizing theology, decolonizing development, and all sorts of papers that have been written using the word decolonization. So my point is that it seems that this notion of decolonization is being deployed as a very comfortable notion. But as Frantz Fanon, the Algerian theorist, put it, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. And I'll unpack this a little bit. Therefore, this lecture on who is speaking on religion and sustainable development, decolonizing theory and practice, will focus on the various ways in which the reproduction of colonial power structures and Eurocentric logics find expression also within the discourse of religion and development. And so to this end, I will discuss decoloniality as a methodological, an epistemological, and pedagogical necessity in the field of religion and development. Now, at the turn of the 21st century, as most of you are familiar with, given that you're working on religion and development, we have witnessed a deep surge of interest in the role of religion in development. And several scholars have offered a very rich analysis of the emergence of this interest, but also how this interest has eventually resulted in the establishment of sub-disciplines of religion and development. And they've also succinctly mapped several trajectories in the literature on religion and development. And I think what's happening at Humboldt is a very classic example of how the establishment of the sub-discipline of religion and development is in fact beginning to take a structural shape, and Humboldt University is a very good example in that regard. Now, in some analysis on the religion and development nexus, in other words, how do we make sense of the relationship between religion and development? Some scholars have focused more on conceptual and methodological issues with a view to developing an analytical framework that might be useful for analyzing the links between religion and development, because those links can be understood in a variety of ways. Now, talking about conceptual and methodological issues makes it necessary in any discussion on religion and development to make some preliminary remarks on how we deploy the concepts of religion and development. I think you'll notice that almost anyone commenting on this is faced with the need to clarify how they use religion and development. And the reason is simply because these are highly contested notions. And as many others have argued, I also deploy and understand religion as a discursive term. And I think that's primarily why it becomes attractive in discussing development. Now, thinking of religion as a discursive term also highlights the nature of religion as a multidimensional and multi-layered concept. And so I will not go into details or even seek to offer a definition of religion, as that is extremely problematic. We have other scholars that try to focus on functionalist understandings of religion, or if you like, ontological understandings. But I think in this discourse of religion and development, we have learned to appreciate religion as a mode of apprehending reality. And this view has been espoused, amongst others, at least within the African context, by Ellis and Tehar, who have argued with respect to Africa, that in Africa, it is largely through religious ideas that Africans think about the world today, and that these religious ideas provide them with a means of becoming social and political actors. And so in this regard, they deploy religion as a mode of apprehending reality. And I think understanding religion as a mode of apprehending reality is not something that is only applicable in Africa. I think this applies anywhere else. Religion is a mode of apprehending reality. And I think Professor Valerian as well hinted on that a day or two ago. Now, to give an example, I'll give an example of Zambia, my country of birth. In the Zambian context, for example, research on how public discourses are shaped, and I'll give one particular discourse in politics, shows the prominent role of religion. Zambia is among the only countries in Africa that has inserted in its constitution that it is a Christian nation. And its politicians use Christianity as a campaign tool. They visit churches and they actually argue against each other on the basis that this candidate is a better Christian than I am. And therefore, if you want a good president, you need a Christian president. So that's an example of how religion is increasingly becoming important in the public sphere in the African context. And therefore, in light of the increasing public role of religion in Africa, as I have hinted on this particular example, for instance, religion is widely recognized as a fundamental socio-political and development force, and thus considered to be an integral aspect of public culture. And it is perhaps this perversity of religion that incited the late doyen of African theology, John Mbiti, to remark that Africans are notoriously religious, and that to African people, man, by which I suppose he meant man and woman, live in a religious universe. So I'm not subscribing to an essentialist understanding of Africans as notoriously religious, but my point is that I think Mbiti's argument would have been grounded in this appreciation of how religion provides a means of actually apprehending reality. Now, returning to religion and development, what do we make of the "and" in the phrase between religion and development? Several scholars have accentuated the role of religion, for example, that religion shapes worldviews, values, and behavior, and therefore religion is significant for development. Some, like Teha and Ellis, whom I have highlighted already, have argued that religious resources produce knowledge that in principle could be beneficial to a community for development processes. And I think it's from this perspective that Ellis and Teha offer a useful way of understanding the multi-level nature of religion, namely that we could think of religion in various ways. We could think of religion in terms of religious ideas, religious practices, religious organizations, and religious experiences. And listening to some of the research that some of the participants in my research group are working, it's very clear that some of you are focusing on religious organizations, some of you seek to focus on religious practices or on religious ideas. So I think this categorization of the various aspects of religion is very helpful to explore in what specific ways does religion actually make a difference to development. Now, others have researched the implications of religious belief and religiosity for development. I think Philip Oman has published an article in that regard. So if you want to explore, for example, does religion really make a difference in development? You could focus on these dimensions, but others are even questioning, does claiming to be religious, for example, if you say I'm religious, to what extent does your being religious actually contribute or influence how you engage in development? Of course, it's another debate. How do you measure religiosity, which I think complicates how we approach the arc between religion and development. Now, at the same time, while many emphasize that religion has a positive role, and they infer that positive role either from particular religious ideas, or they infer from practices, or they infer from the way in which those organizations work in society on the basis of trust or social capital. It is also acknowledged that religion is ambivalent. So the ambivalence of religion also means that religion may at the same time be an impediment to development. And there are many examples that we can cite around the ambivalence of religion to development. Now, thus far, I've only hinted at the concept of religion. Now, the concept of development as well is highly contested, and this is going to be the focus of my discussion. And so I'm not going to offer any definition of development, but suffice it to note that development can be construed in a variety of ways. And I am quite attracted to those descriptions and definitions of development that emphasize well-being and flourishing. We very well know how problematic notions of development and progress can be for a variety of reasons that I will unpack. So I find it quite attractive to think of development in terms of well-being and flourishing. Now, if this is the way in which some have engaged with religion and development, it is very clear that we are bringing together, if you like, two ways of reflecting that perhaps comes from different disciplines. Development originally with its roots in international development, and you could talk about other wings such as development economics, and eventually the birth of development studies and the whole history of how within development studies there was concern around whether religion plays a role or not. And moving on to where we are now, where we have a sub-discipline of religion and development. Now, I would like to argue that this sub-discipline of religion and development is necessarily one that lends itself towards transdisciplinarity. transdisciplinarity. So I would actually argue that there's no need to make for a case for transdisciplinarity. The very nature of religion and development lends itself to transdisciplinarity. There's no way you can engage in this discourse without taking transdisciplinarity seriously. And in this regard, talk about transdisciplinarity is really one that is crucial, because we are concerned in religion and development with that which is at once between, across, and beyond the different disciplines. So it's not just about religion, it's about development, it's also about what we learn from other disciplines. One important commentator on religion and development, Barbara Bompani, has argued in her reflections on religion in the Global South that what we see as the religious, open quote, may reach into virtually every corner of human activity, making the study of religion not a discipline and religion not a subject, but a complex, across, and disciplinary matter. I think Bompani makes an important case here. So, in other words, religion touches just about every corner of human activity, and therefore it lends itself to transdisciplinarity. Now, if that is the case, it is clear that the range of issues which are covered in debates on religion and development calls for such disciplinarity in ways that transcend disciplinary, terminological, epistemological, and ontological assumptions. Researchers thus would have to draw on a variety of methods and analytical frameworks. And in the African context, for example, I would argue that in South Africa, it would be impossible to talk about development without, at the same time, for example, taking seriously narrative theory, because stories are very important among Black South African communities. But also, it's impossible not to draw from Black and liberation theologians, and impossible not to draw on critical race theory, given the history of apartheid. So the point I'm making is that disciplinarity is inevitable. And further, one also needs to see, and I think Professor Bellerem touched on this, so I won't say much more, that to talk about transdisciplinarity is also to highlight that religion and development as transdisciplinary also entails that as researchers, we must construe what we are doing as going beyond the academic to include non-academic collaborations, for instance, with field practitioners and development organizations, amongst others. Nevertheless, I think there's a danger of transdisciplinarity. So there's a benefit of transdisciplinarity, but at the same time, there's a danger of transdisciplinarity. And one of these dangers has to do with the risk of losing focus, method, and analytical power, because you begin to generalize, drawing from the variety of disciplines that you may lose that disciplinary focus. And to address this risk, some, like Barbara Bompani that I have highlighted, have argued instead for what she calls a focused transdisciplinary approach, which in her view maintains and values engagement with the main disciplines rubric, focus, and ideals. So as she argues, and I quote, "Time is calling for the development of critical, engaged, and transdisciplinary epistemic communities committed to nuanced, contextualized research and equipped to engage with the actors who are or will be shaping Africa's future." Close quote. So her point is that we need transdisciplinarity, and in engaging in transdisciplinarity, we need a focused transdisciplinary approach, which is contextual. Now, in my view, Barbara's proposal nevertheless begs further questions around who shapes the envisaged rubrics, focus, and ideals. So it's good to talk about a focused transdisciplinary approach, but who shapes that focus? Now, although Bompani has subsequently pointed out the emerging cause for greater reflexivity, as well as the nexus and power politics within the field of religion and theology, I would like to argue that we are only seeing an emergence of focused research on religion and development that takes seriously cause for decolonization in the field of religion and development. So although there has been attention paid to the problematic of power and politics within this discourse, my argument is that sustained attention on decolonization in the field of religion and development is nascent. Now, while there is no shortage of research that seeks to produce deliberate, contextualized data in the sense of context-bound considerations of the realities of religion and development, there is a need to further examine the why of decolonization. So why should we speak of decolonization in the first place in the field of religion and development? So in the next few minutes, I will try to focus myself on that question: why decolonization in the field of religion and development? So whose development? There have been a number of attempts to highlight some problematics within development discourse, and that is where the heart of decolonizing the field emerges. Very often, development has been portrayed as a global south phenomenon. So each time we talk about development, we think of the so-called global south. We think of Africa, we think of Asia, as if development were a global south phenomenon. Yet, the conceptualization, the dominant practices, and the theorization of development is determined from elsewhere. So in this vein, development has often entailed that Westerners and say Europeans, say Americans, travel to the global south. They collect data, they analyze data, and they make grand theories out of that and publish those findings in the global north. Now, by so doing, there's a sense in which the global south is homogenized, while a white savior complex is often and perhaps even unconsciously foregrounded in several portrayals of development. Now, the Liberian academic and activist Dr. Naija Pillay, and I would really recommend you read her article that I will give her at the end. She has recently questioned whether we can truly open up development without openly talking about how it suffers from a white gaze problem, which she terms the white gaze of development. According to Pillay, quote, the white gaze of development measures the political, socio-economic, and cultural processes of Southern Black, Brown, and other people of color against the standard of Northern whiteness and finds them incomplete, wanting, inferior, or regressive. In essence, white is always right and West is always best, close quote. White in this sense becomes a centralized identity against which all other identities are measured. And stated differently, the white gaze of development assumes whiteness as the primary referent of power, of prestige, and progress across the world. Therefore, deploying race as a lens of analysis, Dr. Pillay interrogates assumptions that modernity and Western whiteness are the primary signifiers of progress and expertise. The white gaze also finds expression in geospatial terms that we often use. For example, when we talk about the third world and the first world, these are not innocent words. These are words that capture the white gaze. When we talk about developed and developing countries, when we speak of the global south and the global north, and within the African context, when we make a distinction between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, all of these reflect the white gaze. And obviously, these binaries are deeply problematic. And therefore, this recognition of the white gaze is something that becomes very crucial. And for example, Samuel Amin, an Egyptian political economist, although he didn't clearly name it as the white gaze, but he very clearly engaged with what he termed as Eurocentrism, and basically argued that Eurocentrism can be understood as the worldview fabricated by the domination of Western capitalism that claims that European culture reflects the unique and most progressive manifestation of the metaphysical order of history. And so implicitly, Amin was also pointing out the white gaze of development. And for Amin, the Eurocentric assumption within, and here I would like to explicitly state, within white European cultural values as superior to those of other societies, is an ideological and a cultural distortion of reality. That's, I think, an important argument Amin made. And further, in his critique of this Eurocentrism, Amin called for what he described as modernity critical of modernity. So, I mean, it was interesting that Amin is trying to challenge Eurocentrism. However, I find issue with his proposal. So his alternative was, in order to challenge Eurocentrism, what you need is to speak of modernity, critique of modernity. And I would argue that's some sort of Marxist critique of Eurocentrism. And it was not necessarily clear what constitutes that modernity, critical of modernity. Does it sufficiently engage or challenge that white gaze, the Eurocentricity that he was critiquing? Another interesting engagement with this problem of the white gaze is offered by an Indigenous studies scholar in Canada, Glenn Cottard, who has written a very interesting book titled Red Skin, White Masks, I think trying to follow the lines of Frantz Fanon, and he actually won a Frantz Fanon award for that book. Now, Cottard deploys what he calls the colonial frame. So for Cottard, the problem around development is a colonial frame, which manifests as an overarching lens of analysis to interrogate, at least in his Canadian context, the practices of settler state dispossession from the perspective of colonial relations. And within the African context, another engagement with this colonial gaze has been offered by Achille Mbembe, who has described the white gaze as a narrative of the Western consciousness of Blackness. And he's done this in a book called A Critique of Black Reason. So he problematizes Blackness as something that was constructed in within Western consciousness. So Western consciousness of Blackness invented, if you like, the other, and that other was named as Black. And over history, those who were named as Black as a matter of judgment, because Blackness was deployed as a matter of judgment, and whiteness presented as the embodiment of normacy, they had to engage with being named Black. And that being named Black, for example, for Steve Biko, he engaged with that from the perspective of a Black consciousness of Blackness. So you have the Western consciousness of Blackness, which invents Blackness as a colonial and racist category. And on the other hand, you have those who've been named as Black taking up their agency and engaging via what Mbembe calls the Black consciousness of Blackness. Now, these various critiques of Eurocentrism and paternalistic assumption in development discourse, which I have tried to engage via what Paile calls the white gaze, has also been somewhat touched on by those scholars drawn to post-development. And I think an interesting name here is Escobar, who is one of the leading voices in the post-development approach. Now, these guys who are drawn to post-development are basically trying to argue that there is so much wrong with the Western construction and discourse of development. And for Escobar, for example, in his view, that which is wrong with the development discourse, it's simply that it is an ideological export and something that is at the same time cultural imperialism. So development discourse for Escobar as a post-development scholar is cultural imperialism. It's ideological and it's cultural imperialism. And so in his analysis, he would argue that if there is a word that has gone unchallenged, it's the word development. It has gone without being challenged. And he's not alone in making this critique. You have others that have joined on the bandwagon of post-development. And most of them basically deploy an argument that basically says, well, development discourse is hierarchical and it is Eurocentric. Now, their argument as an intervention is interesting. However, we can also critique post-development itself. And some of the critiques of post-development itself is simply that it seems to be essentializing, romanticizing, and valorizing the local. Because some post-development scholars basically would argue that, well, the third world has rejected development. The third world has rejected capitalism. But we know that it is not that clear-cut. For example, we know that capitalist consumerism is rampant. And perhaps there's an allure. It's very attractive for poor communities. If you look at rising levels of consumerism, the development of shopping malls in South Africa, in Zambia, in Ghana, it's expanding. It's also not to say that, rejected concepts coming from the West. Coca-Cola is loved by a lot of people, and there's a sense in which this is being embraced. So one would argue that, yes, perhaps there is some essentializing. And perhaps an interesting critique of post-development is, I think, what Paile highlights, namely that post-development itself suffers from a white gaze problem because it is conspicuously silent on race and racialized forms of Northern hegemony. So this white gaze problem of development that I've tried to describe continues to reproduce itself in different ways. I think not long ago, we saw what happened in the US, in the United States of America, when a lot of people ascended on Capitol Hill. And there is no doubt that white supremacist was at its key. We are aware of right-wing ideologies in Europe and many other places where you see this reproduction of the white gaze. And in addition to this white gaze, I think the white gaze also finds expression in what I would put in a nuanced way, drawing on what Hannah Arendt's Nora, I hope I'm pronouncing that German name properly, Hannah Arendt, what Hannah Arendt has called the politics of pity. And my point is that what Hannah has theorized as the politics of pity is very influential, and it has, I think, its place as significant contribution. And I'm not suggesting here, for example, that when you look at journalists and how they present pity through photography and news items, I'm not trying to suggest that photographic representations of events, especially in the so-called global south, I'm not suggesting that those representations may not be a means towards humanitarian goals. There's a possibility that, for example, if there's a disaster in somewhere in Malawi, the photographs that are taken, the news that is told about that, there's a sense in which that portrayal, the engagement of a politics of pity, may result in humanitarian response. My argument is that the white gaze may be discerned in the paternalistic politics of pity, not least because pity may very well constitute hierarchical relations between the sufferer and the viewer of a picture. So, for example, look at pictures of how poverty is depicted in Africa. So it's a face of a black child and a black woman. Now, I want to give another example of this white gaze as it finds expression in media. You have a slide there of a BBC News article by journalist Andrew Harding, which was titled "Coronavirus in Africa. Could Poverty Explain Mystery of Low Death Threat?" Now, this BBC journalist was very shocked that Africans were not dying in huge numbers because of coronavirus. So that speaks to this white gaze. Why did the world expect that Africans would die in millions? And when that didn't happen, why was it a real shock? And then this reporter made this report, and the BBC basically said, coronavirus in Africa, could poverty explain mystery of low death? Now, this caused huge outrage within the South African context that the BBC was forced to change the title of that news article, because you cannot always explain Africa in terms of poverty. It speaks to this white gaze. You can't always depict Africa as being in need of help. So they changed the title of that item to Coronavirus in South Africa. Scientists explore surprise theory for low death rate. Now, this was rather shocking, not least because a lot of South African scientists contributed actually also in research around possible drugs for coronavirus, etc., etc. So this is just another example of how the white gaze finds its expression. Now, although engaging in religion and development through the lens of the white gaze might be interesting, I think that in the African context, a decolonial lens may perhaps be much more necessary. Now, to talk about the white gaze is very important, also important for scholars located in the North as they engage to think about that white gaze. So how do brothers and sisters in the North think about that white gaze? Put differently, how do white people think about the white gaze? How do those that have been labeled Black experience the white gaze? My argument is that perhaps a fruitful way from the perspective of research on religion and development would be to employ a decolonial lens. And this is what I want to tend to, and then I'm done with my presentation. Now, to talk about a decolonial lens suggests the need to decolonize religion, the field of religion and development. But I think it's important if we start using terms such as decolonization, decolonial, perhaps to make a number of distinctions between these different words. If we talk about imperialism, we basically referring to an ideological concept which upholds the legitimacy of the economic and military control of one nation by another. So the concept in my paper is not imperialism. There's a sense in which you could argue that, well, imperialism has changed forms, and that countries that used to be imperial in the past are not necessarily the ones that carry imperial power at the moment. Then there's the term colonialism. Obviously, colonialism can be seen as a form of imperialism, but it also included settlement. It included direct political, social, and cultural domination of the colonized by Europeans. And then you have these other terms that I think are important, and I will return to these. For example, post-coloniality and post-colonial. I would like to make a distinction just before I continue with my talk. One is that I would, in my own research and writing, when I use the term post-coloniality, I like to think of this in terms of the theory of power relations. And so if you think of post-colonial theory, and I think significant names in that regard, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. And then if you use post-colonial with a hyphen, I would like to think of this as an indication of time, so post, after. Now, this thinking or suggestion that we have a period after colonialism is not necessarily true. It is true to the extent that the colonizers handed political leadership to the previously colonized. But it is not true that those previously colonized are no longer colonized. So this notion of post-colonial, that is, we are living in post-colonial times, is problematic. And for that reason, I suggest we make a distinction between post-coloniality as a theory and post-colonial as an indication of time. And I'm making the argument here that I don't think we are in post-colonial times because coloniality has not ended. So that's a new term that I would like us to engage with, coloniality, which is different from colonialism. And I will explain a little bit more on that in a moment. Now, the term decolonization, so to return to decolonization, the term decolonization carries various philosophical connotations. One useful analysis of the various connotations of decolonization has been offered by the Zimbabwean scholar Sabelo Ndlovu-Gateni, who argues that the key problem in Africa pertains to the illusion of freedom and the myth of decolonization. So in other words, Gateni is arguing that it is a myth to suggest that decolonization was effectively done in the 60s and 70s. In his view, a post-colonial Africa has not yet become fully realized. The African post-colonial world remains an aspiration rather than a reality, because a post-colonial world was never born. Rather, what decolonization facilitated was a post-colonial, neo-colonized world. So in other words, colonialism just reinvented itself and retained its specters in various fields. Therefore, to speak of a post-colonial world is a misconception. It is a misconception. Now, while talking about decolonization is obviously not new in Africa, because several scholars have talked about this. Frantz Fanon, Gunji Wationg, and Steve Biko. What is unique in the 21st century discourse, in other words, the contemporary discourse on decolonization? So here I'm trying to make a distinction between political decolonization of the 1970s and contemporary discourses on decoloniality. The two are related, but not necessarily the same. And so what is distinct from the political understanding of decolonization in the 50s and the recent cause for decolonization is that recent calls for decolonization foreground the concept of coloniality as a category of analysis. So they deploy coloniality as a category of analysis. Now, what is coloniality? This notion of coloniality was initially theorized by a Peruvian sociologist by the name of Aníbal Quijano. And the notion illumines the multi-layered and complex process of domination through which Europe instituted various modes of control, and thus what Quijano calls a colonial matrix of power. And so this argument of Quijano, which he called a coloniality of power, or a colonial matrix of power, Quijano was attempting to describe how the West manufactured a matrix for the management and control of the economy, for authority, for knowledge, for gender, but also sexuality and subjectivity. And so Quijano spoke of this colonial matrix in terms of the coloniality of being, and by the coloniality of being is basically speaking to subjectivity. He also spoke of colonial matrix in terms of the coloniality of knowledge. In other words, the only thing that counts as knowledge is Western knowledge. All other knowledge does not count. And also, if you think of the coloniality of gender and sexuality, so how we understand gender and sexuality becomes something that is constructed by the West. And here, one could argue that Christianity is implicated. Now, the best way of understanding this idea of coloniality is basically that coloniality is the darker side of modernity. Now, this is an argument made by Mignolo. So if you think of modernity with its emphasis on reason and progress, the darker side of modernity is coloniality. And coloniality gave birth to these colonial matrices in which the other is defined, what counts as knowledge, what counts as being, and therefore to be is to be white. The knowledge that counts is European or Western knowledge. Now, this concept of coloniality points to the complex and multifaceted nature of coloniality. And the concept, I would like to argue, is significant for unraveling the continuity of colonial mentalities, psychologies, and worldviews beyond the different webs of political domination. So the point is that although political colonization ended in the 60s and the 70s, the philosophy behind that, which is coloniality, has retained its specters well beyond the end of political decolonization. So although political decolonization has ended, there is a sense in which what it means to be is still dictated by a white or colonial frame. What it means to think is still dictated by Western epistemologies. What counts as scientific is still dictated, even though colonialism has ended. And this is what makes decoloniality necessary. In other words, coloniality continued to be present in contemporary times. And within the South African context where I live and work, calls for decolonization have gained significance amidst various populist movements. And they call for debates around transformation and Africanization of higher education. Because it is recognized, and I experience this in the classes that I teach, that very often we disorient our students by expecting of them to engage in foreign epistemologies, foreign ways of understanding, and not taking seriously their own ways of being and their own ways of meaning making and their own ways of constructing knowledge. Not to mention the challenge of expecting students to operate in a foreign language that they can't express themselves effectively, even if they have excellent ideas. And therefore, within such a context, to speak of decolonization in our contemporary times suggests engaging with these continuities of coloniality. They manifest in the way we teach, they manifest in the way in which we go about research. And to conclude, a number of proposals have been provided as one way of decolonizing. One of these has been offered by Achille Mbembe, who observes that decolonizing knowledge is not simply about de-Westernization. So to talk about decolonization is to critique the pretended universality of Western epistemologies and the colonial pretensions of the right way of being, of knowing, and doing. And decoloniality in this regard, therefore, implies that we need to foreground other epistemologies. So epistemologies that count are not only Western epistemologies, there are other epistemologies that count. And this call for grounding other epistemologies and decentering any claim to Western universalism is expressed very brilliantly by Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, who describes it as the plurality of knowledges, or better still, an ecology of knowledges. So what we need is an ecology of knowledges. And these reflections further underscore the situatedness of knowledge. And therefore, to talk about decoloniality is to call for a way for new intercultural communication and for the interchange of experiences and meanings. Now, given that decolonization in the field of religion and development entails a double critique. So in the field of religion and development, decolonization is a double critique. It is a decolonial critique of religion on the one hand, and the decolonial critique of development on the other, which makes the undertaking even more complex. It's a dual critique. And in the African context, much scholarly engagement with religion has tended to focus on Christianity, which even makes it more problematic and necessary to decolonize, not least because of the historic role of mission Christianity in the so-called civilizing mission. So much of the work that is done in religion and development, at least in Africa, is focused on Christianity. And that makes the case for decolonization very important, because Christianity is not innocent from the civilizing mission that basically reduced Africans to being people that have no religion, etc. So finally, I would like to end by suggesting that as ongoing conversation, decolonizing the discourse on religion and development entails foregrounding individual agency and lived faith experiences. So if we're going to decolonize, then we need to take seriously the lived experiences of the people among whom we are doing our research, but also to take seriously their individual agency. Secondly, that we need to recognize that the continuing legacies of colonialism are not only epistemological, they are also structural and normative. And this reflects, for example, in the ways in which university education is structured, but also in terms of how we count as what is proper academic work, what is proper research, who sets the standard. Thirdly, I think there is need to appreciate the contextuality of knowledge. Now, all knowledge is contextual, but it's important to be deliberate about that. And further, to decolonize in the context of religion and development will also entail that for some, learning will mean unlearning certain ways of knowing. So for example, we are accustomed to only certain ways of knowing. For example, I deliberately said, we're not going to read any text for this lecture. But I also had a discussion with a colleague who is white, and I was suggesting to him that, look, in the context of decolonization, I think perhaps you have very little to say, but perhaps a lot to unlearn. So what does it mean to unlearn whiteness? What does it mean to unlearn how we perceive the white gaze? And further, to decolonize will mean mutual learning and intercultural exchange. And here I would like to argue that in the context of research, I think it's perhaps important to explore what would a decolonial research ethic entail. So yes, we talk about research ethics, but what would it mean to take decoloniality seriously? And how would that reflect in terms of our research ethics, in terms of how we engage with our core researchers in the field? And finally, decolonization would have to lead to research partnerships and collaboration. And I think what is already happening at Humboldt is an excellent example of that way of collaborating. So there's no conclusion. It's an ongoing conversation, and I'm happy for engagement, Nora, depending on how you suggest. And then I have some questions that I thought, I don't know how we can arrange this, but I wanted to suggest that if we return, perhaps if we could be put in groups, I'm not sure how that can work. Yes. And that, yeah, those groups deal with a number of these questions. We would assign each group a question. Yeah. So for example, how do you epistemologically position yourself in the field of religion and development? So thinking about knowledge, what counts as knowledge, what would it mean to apply a decolonial lens to research on religion and development? What do you see as implications of employing the decolonial lens for teaching? So if we take the decolonial lens seriously, what teaching and research on religion and development look like within your own context? So the kind of contextual reflection, and is talk of a decolonial praxis feasible? So is there a way in which we could say it's not just theorizing, it's practice? If so, what would that be? And finally, what may be the challenges of mainstreaming decoloniality in your academic context? In my own academic context at the University of the Western Cape, we cannot but decolonize. It's necessary to do that. So I would suggest that you can guide Nora on how we can go about that. So I suggest that we could do that in the next session. And then we could have maybe 30 minutes to come and get feedback and have kind of roundtable conversation. So there's no knowledge coming from the center or from anywhere, but that we can engage with the various responses in an environment of mutual learning, which also means accepting to hear things that you would not naturally want to hear, but also the humility to learn from others. So I'll suggest that you guide.
Sure. Thank you very much, Teddy, for this very rich and interesting presentation. So I would suggest maybe we have still some time for this session, around 25 minutes, to maybe collect questions if there are any, and for the next session to put all the participants in group, and I will share these questions in the chat and send them around via email so that we are prepared to start then and to discuss the questions after a short group work. So if you could stop the screen sharing so that we can see all the hands that are up and see all our participants. I have saved the questions, so no worries about that.
Sure.
The first hand I see up for now is Susanna.
Hi, everyone. Teddy, thank you for a very rich and very inspiring presentation. It's challenging, as you say, but it's very necessary. So I'm very grateful for your lecture today. And I just wanted to, well, I got an email right when we were speaking about a workshop series this month that's organized by the University of Northumbria. And it's called Unlearning Colonialism in Development Research and Practice. So I thought maybe some of you could be interested. So I'm just going to put a link in the chat in case anyone is interested. It has, I think, 4 workshops, and unfortunately the first one was last week, but there are still 3 to go. And also they have a wonderful list of resources on decolonialization and development. So here's the list of resources, and the workshop series is here. Voila. So just a hint to something that might be interesting. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Susanna. It's also great that we are here all in a room and can share resources and links to interesting lectures happening somewhere. Thank you very much. So there are a lot of hands up, so I hope we have time for everyone. Solile, please.
Thank you very much, Nora. And Doc, thank you very much for challenging us in this way. This is definitely not a comfortable topic to handle, but you've given us much thought, food for thought. I've got 2 issues, Doc, that I'm grappling with. One is, I think, Quijano, for me, kind of deals with it when he talks about the coloniality of power. What I'm grappling with, say, is that when you look at history and that power has been used, particularly and primarily by the global north, to make sure that whatever contribution of those who were in the global north was actually nullified. And so we are approaching history, we are all asked to come to the table as equals, and yet our contribution has actually been nullified. And so the whole sense of inferiority complex persists because we feel that we have had no contribution that we have made. And so my question always is, how do we then track and trace what that contribution has been and actually put it on par with all the other kind of contributions to the advancement of human kind of development? And then secondly, linked to that to an extent is, because you mentioned very well that we are not in the post-colonial times, but it's post-coloniality, indicating that colonialism persists. And my question and interest is, to what extent do we, people who have suffered under this, assist in perpetuating this phenomenon. Because, I mean, after so many years, but we still have it, and I foresee that we're still going to be grappling with it. But to what extent are we participating in perpetuating this whole burden? And I think UWC is doing very well in trying to decolonize going forward. But I think we also need to see if there are elements where we ourselves are participating in our own kind of frustration. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe, Nora, if you don't mind, maybe we could have two more, then perhaps, yeah,
sure.
Again, sure.
Yes. So, Philip, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Teddy, for this exciting lecture. Really, it has been wonderful listening, and thank you also, or much appreciation from my side also for mentioning us at the very end as a positive example. It's really something, you know, how to decolonize this kind of academic space or this transdisciplinary space has been something that, you know, we've been thinking about. And it's really, yeah, also, I mean, challenging also in light of the structures that you know, we are all embedded in academia, and that is part of my question. You know, to what extent would you say decolonizing these academic spaces of religion and development is more a structural global kind of approach between you know, center and periphery, or perceived center and periphery, you know, global north, global south, and to what extent, you know, kind of academic hierarchies play a role in their seniority, juniority, you know, you're nothing until you are a full professor, and phenomena like if you have a panel with two elder gentlemen and one younger female junior scholar, that the elder gentlemen sometimes tend to mansplain what the junior scholar has said. So would you say this should all be part of it? Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. We will collect another question. Paulina, please.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Teddy. I really much appreciated listening to you, and it spoke so much to what I'm trying to do in my master thesis right now. And I also try to refer to the same theorists, so I hope I understood it correctly. But I see the risk in reproducing the same structure, because I'm also doing research in the Global South, in South Africa, and I'm a white researcher. And I just wanted to hear if you have any suggestion of how we can combat that risk of reproducing the same colonial structure that we are trying to criticize. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Teddy, would you like us to look into this question before collecting other ones? Okay, please. The floor to you.
Thank you, Nora. Yeah, very complex questions from the three questions. Tolile, yeah, you raise deep questions, and I think that also points to the psychological dimension of colonialism. The reality is that now I speak as African Black man. There's a sense in which I have been brought up to believe that white is super, white is great, white is normative. And I have grown up internalizing that. And if one does not engage with that, it doesn't matter what titles you have. And so I think Deco spoke about the mind of the oppressor as the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor. So I think it's this psychological dimension. So I'm trying to respond one way of engaging. So it's an honest debate. And for example, this has to do with, I live in a community here that is predominantly white. And when I go taking a walk, there are times when I see people thinking, okay, my garden boy or something around here. But also the suspicion, if I drive behind someone who doesn't look like me, we make 2, 3, 4 turns in the same direction, I see they start panicking and they turn without indicating and put my life at risk. So this is a reality of the world in which we live in. So I think it starts from an honest discussion, and so we need to liberate ourselves as Black people. So it's psychological. And how do we, for example, engage with, if you have kids, for example, I'll talk about my son, who goes to a school that is predominantly white. So what is it that my son learns from my interaction with those that may not look like me? That's important in terms of how my son is going to engage with a white gaze. Otherwise, we'll perpetrate the same structure. So very complex, and I think the point is it is psychological. So this internalization of inferiority, and I think perhaps Frantz Fanon put it very, very well in his Philip, yeah, complex questions that I don't think I have an answer, but you are right. This illustrates how complex this challenge is, and I think certain ways of addressing that are not sufficient. For example, to simply argue that you need diversification of staff, right? So let's give an example that you need to appoint an African at Humboldt to demonstrate that. But that also comes with its own challenges. To what extent are you just moving faces? But the real thinking still remains in the same places, right? Inviting people to the table to fill a chair and not contribute to the discourse. So those are some of the deep questions. So here I'm arguing, others might say, well, we need to diversify. Perfect, but it's beyond that. You could argue, for example, that, well, we need to include written texts and sources by scholars from other regions. Fine, good step, but that is not everything. The nature of academy, as you have said, Philip, hierarchy. Is it even possible to envision academia without notions of excellence? And could we envision notions of excellence without thinking about ways of grading excellency? And in that sense, hierarchy. So those are complex questions that then begin to speak to institutional cultures. And perhaps for me, that's where decolonial praxis becomes important, so that it's not just something on paper, but how can this be embodied? Because it's not theory, it's the nature of how the world is raised and gendered in this way. So how do we then engage in terms of decolonial praxis? And Paulina, I fully understand the concern that you raise and the potential danger of doing that, and that is why I'm trying to suggest that perhaps we need to start asking about what decolonial research ethic might entail. So decolonization doesn't mean that we should stop engaging in research, or that, for example, those of us located in the South should not do research in the North. It's a question of why Africa is researchable and not the West. So I think those are some of the questions that we need to ask. Why do we see research topics elsewhere and not, for example, within the German context? So if a German is interested in decolonization, how about thinking about whiteness, right? So not one answer, but I think these are some of the questions, yeah, for ongoing conversation. And in doing so, not being essentialist, right? Not being essentialist, but we envision decoloniality as opening up space for intercultural exchange, because other challenges, for example, for myself, trained as a theologian, can I thoroughly speak about decolonization and still remain a Christian? So those are some of the deep question. Can I completely throw away notions of universalism and still talk about ecumenism? So these are some of the ongoing challenges within the discourse. Thanks, Nora.
Thank you very much. I see a few more hands up, so maybe we collect a few more questions. Catherine, please. Catherine, if you are speaking, we are not hearing you. You have to unmute your mic first.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you, Catherine.
Thank you so much for Dr. Teddy and the lecture this morning. My question is, how do we decolonize learning in schools or in countries, in some countries that are found in Africa, whereby they use the white guys' languages and other examples instead of using African examples or languages. I've heard him talk about in South Africa, they are kind of turning to a language where somebody can express himself properly than cleaving to a foreign language. How do we help such countries to actually decolonize some of the things some of the lessons they teach in their schools? For example, in Kenya, we don't have a problem of decolonizing some subjects, some teachings. In fact, every class or every grade, they're kind of teaching in English. You find a pupil of grade 1 speaks good English. Is it because we want, I don't know how to put it. I just want Dr. Teddy to help me to understand this. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We will collect a few more questions before we answer your question. Sharon, please.
Thank you, Doctor. This was a great lecture. I think this lecture was like a blade. It cuts to the heart of the problem, but also when something cuts you, it hurts when it goes to the heart. So it's actually wonderful to hear things like this. Thank you. It was great. I also have a question, and it's very close to Catherine's question. So I'm just going to piggyback off what she's asking, and it's also just about language and how powerful language is. And it's so powerful that we're actually using it right now. This is the way we're communicating. We're all communicating in English to one another. And I'm not sure if it's any one of us's first language. So in a sense, we're all failing while we're talking to one another and not actually hitting or correctly accentuating or punctuating what we want to say. We're all failing while we're doing this. And in a sense, language also creates our reality. So my question is, can language be decolonized? Can English as a language, because this is a necessity. In South Africa, English is an absolute necessity for us. We won't be able to survive without this language. But can it be decolonized? And the debate around language at the universities in South Africa now is a hot debate. It's something that's being debated at Stellenbosch University. It's a big thing. I won't go into that. But as you were even giving your lecture, I was something just popped into my mind about this almost, I'm not using the right words, so please just forgive me before I even speak. But so this colonized English that's everywhere. As you're giving your lecture, you're referring to the darker side of something, and that word means it's bad. But who decided dark is bad and light is good? Who decided this? Who made this differentiation? But we use this language, and this language keeps on having an impact on us, even though we don't recognize it. It's busy assaulting us and changing us. So I'm just piggybacking onto Catherine and asking, can we decolonize language? Is it possible for us to do this?
Thank you, Cheryl. We will go to Patricia and then also afterwards end, I think, this round of question and see if we can continue it after the task we'll be having in the seminar session. So please, Patricia.
Thank you, Dr. Ted, for the brilliant presentation this morning. Where I'm speaking from not just an African woman, but from a South African context. As much as we all agree that there will never be a post-colonialism, but we are living in coloniality contemporarily. This is very true. But from a South African concept, the problem is, I don't know, it seems deeper than ever because it's also psychological, because it is colonialism, and then it is the apartheidism. All the isms are prejudicial, and people are displaced and disconnected. There is so much that is happening, and so this becomes a psychological, deep-rooted in our lives. And to make it worse, we are supposed to, we are not that we are supposed to, because we are humans, we share space and we live along each other. I live in Bloemfontein, which is predominantly white, because that's the area that I chose to live with my family. My children have been in white schools, and socialization, I call my house a United Nations, because our children, they do not even realize that they are Black. When they were small, there was just an incident where when they were still in the early grades, and this is a friend playing at my house, and the innocent Sabrina, she's asking my daughter, that Claudia Rose, are you sure you're Black? So Claudia, these are 4-year-olds. So Claudia Rose, which is mine, she says, I don't know, I guess so, but I'll ask my mom. My mom knows everything. So already this is happening with the children. And I'm listening to this conversation and I'm waiting, okay, let these girls come, then I can say. But first and foremost, these are innocent children. But what is happening in the homes, probably at Sabrina's house, because Sabrina further says to Claudia Rose that if you are really Black, we know what clothes, then you should be living far away, like Rebecca. Far away, it is dark, there's no road, but my mom knows how to get there, because we need Rebecca to clean our house. And then Claudia Rose says, okay, we have Dora, but Dora lives with us, because mom says Dora cannot go far away. So I'm listening to these conversations. I says, okay, this is something that is very deep, because we're living in an era, and I'm not going to now start moving to another area where I'm supposed to be associated with the people that look like me. And this is one complex. And then when it comes to academic education, I really struggled especially during my undergraduate, because I thought this is now university, so things will change. Probably we won't be subjected to some modules that you don't even want to know. And as a systematic theology, you are doing practical theology, you are doing every kind of theology in one. And there are some modules that you are saying that whoever wrote this, were they thinking? How long ago was this done? But there I'm subjected to this because I need to. And then you can't wait to finish this undergraduate and say, oh Lord, help me to do my research where I can at least specialize in something that I can enjoy while I'm doing. That's how then it becomes, okay, now I can do my own research work. But then when it comes to decolonizing, which is the very word that is thrown left and right at the universities, especially from a South African context, that we need, like Teddy has just explained, that we need to decolonize languages so that we can not subject our students to be using a language that they do not understand. They cannot express themselves freely. But which language is that? Because in South Africa, there are 11 languages. One of the 11 languages that are spoken in South Africa is mine, which is Siswati. It is spoken by 3 people in the entire country. Where I live in Bloemfontein, there's not a single person who speaks my language. So how will that help with all these vast languages when it comes to the academic sphere, where we need to decolonize and over-decolonize? So the whole thing just become a conversation, of course, which is an ongoing conversation, but one that is so confusing. That's all I can say. How do we go forward from this? That's my main question. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much. I would like to take the last question from Deirdre, and we will just shift our break a little bit. Yeah, so just let us please continue the discussion.
Thank you, Nora. I appreciate that. Thank you, Teddy. Sorry, Doctor. I know Doctor personally from UWC. Doc, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Really enjoyed that. Haven't heard such in a very long time. I just wanted to also highlight one important thing before I get to my question. And what you mentioned about, you know, the decolonialization aspect, even a very difficult word to utter, and of how do we employ this within our, you know, how you have started because we're a social justice institution, embedded in Christian values, but we focus on the global ethic of all inclusiveness. So we have started in our curriculum and our pedagogies to employ, you know, so that our students become critical thinkers and grapple with the issues that we are currently grapple within the context within South Africa and within the communities. So we bring that kind of pedagogical approaches in our approaches. But what I wanted to talk about is the difficulty of, you know, we cannot completely take Western theories and concepts or epistemologies away, because it's important, and it has kind of want to completely demolish those theories, because that they can't be done, because it contributed to where we are, you know, in some way. What we are asking is our epistemologies in Africa, you know, the people's stories, and they derive from people's stories, which you can see it's important for the West because they can do the research and so forth here. But when we come in these spaces and we, you know, and we understand it's important to speak from a research perspective, theories, concepts, and so forth, but bring it together with a lived experience, because ultimately it's the lived experiences that count and that makes these theories and makes these concepts. But when we come into these spaces, then and we bring together those kind of lived experiences and into these spaces, then it's been rejected, because what is in the importance is only the research, you know, concepts and theories and so forth, of which we understand it's important as scholars and educators, but we're also asking, how do we bring this lived experience? We speak that it's important, we say it's important, but yet we still reject it in these spaces. And can you please just help me understand how one overcome those kind of things, although we speak one thing, but we do another? Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you all for your questions. I would like to hand over to you, Teddy. Yeah.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks for all the questions. I think what's quite evident from the conversation that we are having is that, yeah, this is a necessary conversation we need to have, and it's an ongoing conversation, and thus complexity of the matter. Cheryl, I fully agree with you, and yeah, it's brilliant that you point the darker side of modernity. Thanks. That's brilliant. Also blind spots, you know? And this is what happens with, and I think you put it very well, the reality that we're trying to grapple with. And your question around language, which is linked to Catherine's question, I think in the Kenyan context, Gunjiwa Thiongo did interesting work in the context of literature, trying to emphasize on the importance of the vernacular, and I think his work in the 70s also highlighted the ways in which language was used by the colonizer to impose particular ways of thinking. But obviously, we also need to recognize the changing times, but also the extent to which we can think of language as a tool in ways that do not blind us to the destructive ways in which language can be used. Certainly, thinking of, for example, students in South Africa who can only think clearly in Afrikaans, and to expect that they should be imposed with English obviously raises similar challenges, you know, around imposing English on someone who does not fully understand the language. I mean, all of us, I mean, English is not my first language. So if I tell you that if something smells nice and I say, did you hear? You shouldn't be surprised I'm saying, did you hear rather than smell? Because in my language, to hear, to smell, it's one and the same thing. So I'll not even realize the number of times I use smell for hearing. But the point is, I think we do not need to be essentialist in the way in which we talk about language, and I think also be contextual in the sense of the context in which these discussions find expression. If you think about debates at University of Pretoria around students in medicine and engineering and that, or history, then surely we need to pay particular attention to the context. And so context, I think, you can't generalize. We need to be contextual and in that regard. Patricia, I think you highlight the complexity of these questions, and I think perhaps in our group discussions we can take that even further. Deirdre, I think the point around the locus of initiation. So if all knowledge is situated, but also how do you position yourself as a researcher? That becomes very important. And again, you also hinted on the problematic of language. Now, I'm going to say something that is funny. My home language is Bemba in Zambia. Now, I was just talking about decolonization. Ask me to tell you what decolonization is in my language. I don't know. I don't know. So this highlights, and I mean, if you do a Google search, I did this experiment. You find certain translations of decolonization in Zulu, and I chatted with colleagues. I chatted with a Nigerian colleague, and he says, I don't think Google knows what Google is saying this thing really is. So I think this illustrates the complexity of language, and I think we need to be contextual. And again, decolonization is not basically saying we don't want anything to do with the West. I think it's really about intercultural communication. And of course, this language of center and peripheral is problematic. And even to say, you know, we have a circle. So the moment you start talking about a circle, you're excluded. So who is drawing that circle? So I think we have to live with these tensions because the way we say, no, we need a circle, you're already excluded. So who is in and out of the circle? But I think to think of decolonization as in terms of intercultural space and pay attention to how we construct being and knowledge remains crucial. So I hope we could take further some of these discussions in the groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teddy. I would suggest that we start not as indicated on the program at 11 German South African time, but rather at 11:10. Thank you very much. Please be on time so that we can start our group time on time, group work on time, and have a good break. Thank you. Teddy, would you like each group to focus on one question? Did I understand you correctly? Each group one question? Or do you want them? Yeah, okay. I can't hear you, but I see you nodding.
Okay, sure. Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Yeah, so I think we have about 5 questions. I'm not sure if we can do 5 groups. Otherwise, we could do 4 groups. And then the 5th question. Yeah. What may be the challenges of mainstreaming decoloniality in your academic context can be discussed by all the groups.
Okay, great. Then I will do 4 groups and let them know about what to do. Very good.
Sure.
Thank you. See you in a bit then.